Let's take a look at political and administrative values. Our discussion of political and administrative values has three purposes: to understand the fundamental beliefs underlying American government and public bureaucracy, to recognize the impact of values in public administration, and to see the ways in which value conflicts affect politics and administration. Political values refer to the basic beliefs about politics and appropriate government relationships to private activity. Links to economic activity and political values are relevant to a discussion of public administration because of increasing government responsibility in regulating businesses and industry. In general, the United States is regarded politically as a liberal democracy and economically as a capitalist system. Liberal democracy is a fundamental form of political arrangement founded on the concepts of popular sovereignty and limited government. A capitalist system is an economic system in which the means of production are owned by private citizens. Popular sovereignty is a form of government by the ultimate consent of the governed. It implies some degree of popular participation in voting and other political actions, although this does not necessarily mean mass or universal political involvement. Limited government refers to devices built into the Constitution that effectively limit the power of government over individual citizens. The specific vehicle for popular rule has been representative democratic government. Initially, Americans emphasized legislative representation, which is stressed by the Constitution. Representation is a principle of legislative selection based on a number of inhabitants or amount of territory in a legislative district. Adequate, fair, and equal representation has become a major objective of many who feel that they've been denied it in the past and now seek to have greater influence, particularly in administrative decision-making. Representativeness suggests groups that have been relatively powerless should be represented in government positions in proportion to their numbers in the population. Concern for political representation and democratic representativeness in administrative organizations has diminished in the more recent years. These subtle changes in meaning have cumulatively made it more difficult to determine whether democratic or administrative values are being manifested. Public discontent with affirmative action, immigration policies, and government spending has prompted groups to challenge these policies by placing them on the ballot to decide their future through public initiative or referenda. Limited government reflects the predominant view of those who frame the Constitution that governments could pose a basic threat to individual liberties. Therefore, they incorporated into the Constitution four devices that effectively limit government: checks and balances, separation of powers, federalism, and judicial review. In addition to this fragmentation of government powers, the Bill of Rights established broad areas of protection for individual liberties and personal privacy against encroachment by official government action. Judicial review is the constitutional power of the courts to review the actions of executive agencies, legislatures, or decisions of lower courts to determine whether judges, legislators, or administrators acted appropriately. Individualism is a philosophical belief in the worth and dignity of the individual, particularly as part of a political order. Pluralism is a social and political concept stressing the benefits of group organization as a means of protecting broad group interests in society. Our emphasis on the individual is evident in the protections for civil rights and liberties, but it also implies the right to participate meaningfully in the political process. The rights of all citizens to organize and advance their interests links the Bill of Rights, individualism, and pluralism, suggesting that individual freedom includes the unrestricted right to be active in organized interest groups. These values serve as standards against which political reality is measured. A major political value in America has been representative democracy. An increasing emphasis has been placed on democratizing political processes. Representative democracy stresses that representatives are nominated and elected from individual districts. They comprise a legislature that makes binding decisions for its society. The reality is that some elements of democracy are universally supported or nearly so, whereas others are the subject of nearly continuous controversy. The former enables the political system to make and implement binding decisions through popular control. The latter permits those not in the majority the freedom to voice their political views and otherwise be politically active. Directly related to these principles are the constitutional guarantees of a free marketplace of political ideas. That is, the freedom to speak, write, and publish political concepts and commentaries, including those out of favor with officials in the majority of citizens. Numerous studies of public opinion suggest, however, that many Americans are inconsistent in their willingness to allow free expression of unpopular ideas. Most would also argue that democracy requires widespread involvement in the election of public officials by means of voting and active participation in political campaigns. One element emphasized in the last half century as essential to democratic government is direct participation in making and administering important decisions by those affected most directly by them. Calls for participatory democracy in general and participatory management have been met increasingly with positive responses. Whether representative democracy requires widespread direct participation is debatable, but merely raising the question has had an impact on our thinking about democracy and on the ways some decisions have been made. Another idea about democratic government, closely related to direct participation, was an expanded definition of what constitutes representativeness in our major institutions. It's been argued that those institutions had not been sufficiently responsive to the needs, interests, and preferences of many groups. Divisive issues involving economic competition and regulation, compensation, collective bargaining, and popular representativeness have recently tended to center on the roles of administrative entities. Public administration in America has been profoundly affected by the evolution of political values. It's been shaped in part by actions and concepts that limit government while also having an effect on those devices. In particular, government bureaucracies have both contributed to and benefited from what some have called the tilt towards the executive branch of government during the late 20th and early 21st centuries. If public administration had been shaped solely by changing political values and interplay of political forces, it would have been altered considerably from its earliest forms and practices. Administrative values have also figured predominantly in its evolution. American public administration is grounded in certain fundamental assumptions that have dominated administrative thinking for more than a century. It's been freely assumed that politics and administration are separate and distinct. Since the reforms in the late 19th century, it's been commonly assumed that partisan politics should not intrude on public management processes. Policy directions and administrative management of public programs were thought of as different processes controlled by different hands. This conception of bureaucracy is like a finely tuned machine that is activated only when someone else pushes the button. The purpose of developing a science of administration was to increase economy and efficiency in government and to use these principles as measures of administrative performance. There are some problems created by administrative values that stress separation of politics and administration while at the same time emphasizing efficiency in government operation. The separation between politics and administration probably would have been seen by the Constitution's authors as either undesirable or impractical. They would have been suspicious of the developments that insulated important decision makers, such as administrators, from accountability to the voters or the voters' elected representatives. Public agencies and administrators have both the authority and power to make a host of decisions, both large and small, that have real impacts on public policy. Instituted a century ago in response to unmistakable partisan excesses, protections against undue manipulation have given rise to the possibility of administrative excesses. There's some tension between the major emphasis of the Constitution and of those administrative values. The underlying values of administration, on the other hand, point towards efficiency as a desirable feature of government operation and a key standard for evaluating government performance. Pluralist democracy is a normative model of administrative activity characterized by dispersion of power and suspicion of any concentration of power. This is effectively the opposite of the administrative efficiency model. Administrative efficiency is a normative model of administrative activity characterized by concentration of power and centralization of government policy making. Both sets of values continue to influence American government, and inconsistencies between them have been difficult to reconcile. On the other hand, efforts to maintain efficiency of operations while holding administrators accountable have been successful. Popular control of government has always been a matter of considerable importance in American politics. This relatively simple, clear-cut arrangement for accountability and popular control has become responsive to other kinds of political pressure. Accountability is a political principle in which government agencies and organizations are subject to the same form of external control and accountability for their actions. It's not surprising that there are still concerns about public access to government and influence over what government does. Today, many fear that democratic values are endangered by government actions that will take place without popular control and consent. Democracy requires mechanisms for both participation and accountability ensured by an independent judiciary, uncensored media, and free elections. Public administration, however, poses problems for that type of system. It does not fit with the idea of elected public officials because most bureaucrats are not elected, and professional values usually emphasize expertise, limited access, knowledge, and security over accountability, participation, transparency, and democratic control. Growing societal complexity and increasing administrative responsibilities require more specialized bureaucratic professionals, as well as new and varied forms of administrative activity like contracts, grants, and regulation. And at the same time, disadvantaged groups and others have turned to government bureaucracy more frequently for various kinds of aid and to demand a greater role in making policies that affect them. Often, the result has been a conflict between the need for professionalism and technical competence and insistent demands for citizen participation in more aspects of policymaking. In addition to accountability and participation, bureaucracy is also concerned with representativeness. Holding government officials accountable for their actions and that of others is crucial to democratic governance, even more so when substantial responsibility is entrusted to non-elected administrative personnel. Publicity has long been known as one means to enforcing accountability by providing information to citizens who can act more intelligently and purposefully on whatever the issue may be. Sunshine laws are acts passed by Congress that some states and localities require that legislative and administrative procedures be held in public rather than behind closed doors. Sunset laws are provisions in laws that government agencies and programs have a specific termination date. By requiring positive legislative action to renew agency mandates, there's a virtual guarantee that some examination of agency performance will take place. Once again, the public seems to be looking at its legislative representativeness, or their representatives themselves, to provide greater popular control over executive branch agencies. Increasing government activity caused rising citizen concern about administrative decision-making and access to information. The Freedom of Information Act, known as FOIA, passed by Congress and some state legislatures, establishes procedures through which private citizens may gain access to a wide variety of records and files from government agencies. The effect of this statute was to increase the potential for citizen access to a wide variety of government records and files. The FOIA records of recent administrations have been somewhat mixed. Proponents of greater access to government information have seen some of the developments as being very positive. Sunshine laws, which have been passed at all levels of government and apply mainly to legislative procedures, have also been enacted for administrative agencies. The greatest potential beneficiaries are organized groups of citizens who seek to monitor and influence the decision of administrative agencies. There's also growing concern that government and bureaucracy are not doing enough to protect individual privacy and ensure that government records concerning affairs of private citizens are fair and accurate. This is particularly sensitive in terms of an issue when we view electronic information capabilities of government today. The ideology of citizen participation has firm roots among our political values, especially participatory democracy. The push for greater citizen participation in government decision-making was reborn in the 1960s. It originated in demands by minorities for a larger voice in determining policies and programs directly affecting them. Forums and practices of citizen participation are numerous, ranging from advising agencies to attending hearings to actual decision-making itself. In the delivery of human services, individuals act as co-producers of services by their involvement in program operations. Viewing citizens as co-producers is different but highly relevant conception of participation that has expanded with wider use of electronic communications in government. Ideological differences about the extent of citizen participation and debates over its place in governing are related to the continuing debate in American politics over centralization of administrative authority. Particularly as practiced in the federal system, citizen participation represents an application of a decentralist principle, which assumes value and purpose in delegating decision-making authority to affected persons and groups. Decentralization as a mode of operation clearly permits wider participation and lends more legitimacy to both the process and the outcomes of decision-making. Citizen participation, fostered by many organizational programs, has been a key mechanism used to promote decentralization of operating responsibility. The concept of participation has been applied in different ways to varying programs. Neighborhood and citizen action organizations sprang up for the purpose of preserving neighborhood character and sometimes redevelopment of physical structures in the neighborhood. Citizen participation has also been incorporated into formal mechanisms for decision-making. Agencies and commissions have legal, discretionary authority to decide just how much public participation to permit and, particularly, whether and how to finance participation by those with limited resources. Public interest groups are organized lobbying groups that represent primarily non-economic interests in influencing public policy. There has been a considerable frustration on the part of so-called public interest groups, which has been slow to gain access to regulatory proceedings. There's the possibility that officially sponsored citizen participation will tend to be tokenism rather than true representation. Decentralizing and localizing control over government programs may not guarantee either increased participation at the local level or more democratic operations. If citizen participation is designed to keep bureaucracy accountable to the general public, it has a mixed record of success. A widely accepted concept affecting participation is citizen input. Many of us seem to assume that we should seek to gather input in decision making. There are other possibilities like partnership where input is an inappropriate concept. To think only in terms of input serves to limit the variety of ways that participation can occur. Citizen participation has dramatically changed decision-making in many policy areas and has taken its place as a major feature of democratic administration. There are several approaches to representation. Should constituents' opinions and preferences be conveyed to the government official and influenced and reflected faithfully in legislative voting? Or should a representative exercise independent judgment and individual conscience in making decisions? The first option, labeled the delegate role, maximizes the public's impact on decision making, but does not take advantage of the representative's potentially superior knowledge of details and subtleties in making choices. The second, labeled the trustee role, emphasizes the representative's capabilities and the public's trust in their interest will be faithfully served. In both instances, we're depending on our representatives to somehow serve the public interest. Unfortunately, it is rarely clear how elected officials make their decisions and whose voices they listen when they're trying to act in the public interest. That ambiguity is complicated considerably when the focus shifts to the administrative context. That's because bureaucracies in American politics have a representation function, and some sorts of questions must be answered. But historically, bureaucratic agencies have served narrow constituents in specialized interests. How can these administrative patterns be reconciled with democratic values that emphasize broader popular representation? A key test for how democratic administrative processes will be is the degree to which representation is inclusive of existing interests in society. Another concern is the extent of effective access given to those not already a part of the interaction process. Another essential difficulty in representation concerns the delegation of authority. We delegate our authority to legislatures to make our laws, knowing that representation of our every view is imperfect. Once discretionary authority enters the picture, which it clearly does in nearly all forms of administrative decision making, the representational quality of decisions may be diminished. So the only way to make bureaucracy more predictable is to reduce the discretion technical experts in bureaucracy are permitted to exercise. Finally, bureaucratic representation is inhibited by longtime practices insulating administrative personnel from direct political pressures. Several studies suggest that national government civil servants are imperfectly representative of the public at large in demographic terms. Women, gays, and ethical minorities in particular have taken the virtually unanimous position that greater representativeness is needed to enhance general understanding of which civil service and the problems confronting minority groups present themselves when it comes to proper public administration and policy making. This issue of representativeness is obviously one that has many sides to it. In general, the effort to increase representativeness based on gender and race is founded on the belief that government would otherwise ignore their concerns in program design and in management. Responsiveness of public officials to popular sentiments depends on several factors in the governmental process. It depends fundamentally on people's assumptions about what is and what should be the conduct of government and public policy making. It's not only a matter of what we establish very loosely as our governmental and societal objectives, it's also what we take for granted in our expectations about government activity. Responsiveness also requires meaningful access to right decision makers and a legitimate opportunity to be heard. Citizens cannot easily attain bureaucratic responsiveness because of restrictions on their expertise, time, and access to decision makers. Government and its agencies have to be able to respond to potential emergencies and ongoing policy and program demands in new ways to meet new threats. There are two major constraints on responsiveness. Ideally, public expectations should be realistic, reasonable, and manageable. Admittedly, anyone in government can hide behind excuses to avoid tackling hard problems that may need the attention of government officials. But there are conditions that are difficult to deal with. For example, crime, environmental pollution, and poverty. The second constraint on responsiveness is that government agencies cannot respond equally to all societal interests. Inevitably, some groups view government as unresponsive because it doesn't respond to them. Government can only be responsive to specific sets of interests and preferences that exist in society at large. It's increasingly possible that as government strengthens, it acquires additional potential for diluting individual liberties. This does not necessarily occur from deliberate decisions in the highest councils of government. It can, however, simply be an overzealous implementation of perceived mandates by an individual agency or a bureaucrat. The US Patriot Act loosens the procedures of rules of evidence for surveillance, investigation, spying, and jailing of terrorist suspects. President Bush signed the act into law on October 26, 2001, just 5 weeks after the September 11th attacks on New York and Washington. It's a large, complex, and hastily drafted law that was passed by Congress over the objectives of civil liberties groups on both ends of the political spectrum. The Act gives the executive branch extensive powers and a wider range of tools to limit freedoms of speech, privacy, and due process. The essential point is that government grows stronger and the potential for infringement on individual rights increases. This causes operating problems for those in public administration, but because of the basic values at issue, all of society is ultimately involved. Nonetheless, Congress reauthorized the act in 2011 amid renewed concerns for homeland security. Like most government institutions, administrative agencies function within complex frameworks of widely scattered legal and political power. Both the formal structure of government power and the actual competition for power reflect a lack of centralization in the political system. Competition for power includes conflicts among the branches of government, with the two major political parties and continual fighting for position among interest groups. The dispersal of power is sustained by the non-centralized nature of the American economy and society when its strong cultural emphasis on capitalism, individualism, and pluralism. Wide dispersal of political power both constrains and creates opportunities for stakeholders to gain leverage in an area of policy. The key to understanding why bureaucratic agencies are forced to play political roles is the lack of cohesive political majorities within the two houses of Congress and under the programmatic mandates often enacted by Congress. Congress, lacking majorities that can speak with clear and consistent voices for sustained periods of time, is characterized instead by shifting political coalitions. Most of the time, legislatures delegate to administrators the authority necessary to craft specific meaning into provisions of the law and then implement them. Agencies are obligated to make judgments about legislative intent and program management. These decisions carry with them significant political implications. Legislative oversight is a legitimate function of Congress, one that can result in fairly strict control by a legislative committee or subcommittee of actions taken by administrators under its jurisdiction. Presidents, who might be expected to provide leadership for bureaucracy from a relatively solid base of political support, ordinarily lack the sort of backing that would allow them to take unequivocal policy positions. A few generalizations about the political environment of bureaucratic power should be noted. First, formal definitions of agency power or responsibility are not likely to reveal the full scope of actual power or influence. Second, the amount of independent bureaucratic agencies have in any specific situation is influenced by the power relationships they have with other politicians and institutions. Third, the exercise of bureaucratic power is frequently characterized by conflicts among agencies over program jurisdiction. In their quest for sufficient power, bureaucratic agencies seek support from coalitions of interest groups, which in turn are organized to pursue policy objectives of their own. Agencies always seek to obtain control over programs that have strong support from influential constituencies. Finally, government institutions, including administrative agencies, play at least two roles in the exercise of power and decision-making authority. These roles often overlap, but are conceptually distinct and can sometimes conflict. On the other hand, government institutions also serve in arenas of political competition where various forces contend for dominant influence in the decision-making process. At issue every time Congress makes a decision is control of the way the question is presented, possible amendments, uses of numerous tactics to speed up or delay consideration, and other tactical questions. Administrative agencies try to strike a manageable balance between what they can do to further their own interest and what they must do to ensure their survival. In addition to those internal skills, an agency must maintain expertise in its program responsibilities and political support. One of the major foundations of bureaucratic power is the collective expertise an agency can bring to programs it oversees. As various facets of society have become more complex, experts have acquired increasing influence because of their specialized knowledge. Government is subject to the same forces as the rest of society. This is especially true of government functions such as intelligence gathering that are uniquely affected by technological change. Reliance on experts' advice is not without limits, and the influence of experts is similarly constrained. Two aspects of experts' increasing control of bureaucratic discretion are worth noting. First, by exercising discretion, an expert decides how to go about implementing the public policies over which the agency has jurisdiction. Second, bureaucratic discretion enables agency experts to influence policy decisions by defining the alternatives higher level officials choose from. Experts possess another useful resource: their ability to speak the language of their respected trades, concepts unfamiliar to most of us. By using jargon, bureaucratic experts make it very difficult for others to challenge them on their own territory, so to speak. This obscurity that previously was the source of strength for experts has contributed to a growing public disenchantment with big government. Political support for administrative agency has a number of key dimensions. First and foremost, the legislature is a major potential source of support that must be carefully and continuously cultivated. A second major source of support is the executive branch, which is comprised of the president, governor, or mayor, or other administrators and agencies formally lodged in the executive hierarchy. A second means of acquiring executive branch support is by partnering with other agencies with common objectives. A third major source of support is constituent groups that depend on an agency to satisfy their policy demands. The political relationship that usually develops between an agency and a constituent group is highly reciprocal. There's a give and take relationship. Although agencies have multiple sources of support which allows them to operate more effectively, this also means that different sources demand different things from the agencies, and they all have different priorities. Sometimes an agency may have to give up some of its control to outside influences, such as legislatures or private groups, in return for continuing political support. If the agency fails to regain or maintain control, it's said to have undergone cooperation, where a set of outside interests acquires the ability to influence the agency's long-term policies. A fourth source of political support or opposition for administrative agency is the general public itself. In political terms, an agency's overall success can be best achieved by controlling its programmatic responsibilities while maintaining adequate support from its operations. More frequently, agencies adapt to particularly strong interests, whatever they might be. There are certain important parallels between the national government bureaucracy and the US Congress. First, within both, there's a well established pattern of a division of labor. In Congress, work is divided among committees and subcommittees of each chamber. Second, the divisions within both Congress and the bureaucracy are organized primarily according to function and deal with general areas of policy concern such as education, housing, labor, or defense. Third, the specialized nature of these smaller units is the principal source of their influence in the policymaking process. It's a pervasive, unwritten rule of Washington political life that all other things being equal, larger institutions defer to the judgments of their more specialized units. In Congress, through bills passed by the full House and Senate must be identical. Committee proposals usually form the core of bills that are eventually passed. In the bureaucracy, specialized personnel wield considerable influence in the formation of proposals that make their way up the hierarchical ladder into the daily processes of program implementation. It's misleading to assume that influence is constrained only at the top in either Congress or the bureaucracy. The nuts and bolts of administration are normally centralized and concentrated in the lower levels of government organizations, not at the top or even very near it. Members of Congress also seek to become specialized for two reasons. First, they're encouraged to do so by constituent interests on the grounds that it's the best route to influence in Congress. Second, they quickly recognize that by becoming influential, they can do far more for their voters back home. Obviously, members of Congress do not always get their first choices of assignment in these committee areas that are so important to influence. Constituency is any group or organization interested in the work of a given official, agency, or organization and the potential source of support for it. This naturally leads to increased contact between legislatures and others interested in the same policy areas. The coalition of shared specialized interests produces the potential for pooling political resources by individuals and small groups in different parts of the policy-making arena in order to achieve common purposes. Hundreds of quiet, informal alliances have appeared in this manner, described as a policy subsystem. A subsystem is any political alliance uniting members of an administrative agency, a congressional committee or subcommittee, and an interest group with shared values and preferences in the same arena or area of policy making. Subsystems are the informal alliances or coalitions that link individuals in different parts of the formal policy structure. The strength of subsystems lie in its ability to combine the benefits of bureaucratic expertise, congressional leverage, and interest groups in organizing the opinions of those most concerned with a particular public issue. Subsystem activity tends to remain behind the scenes. Policy decisions are reached in the spirit of friendly, quiet cooperation among various interested and influential people. Bureaucrats derive considerable benefit from this arrangement because they can usually count on support from the Congress and the iron triangle formed of interest groups. Sometimes referred to as the iron triangle, this three-sided relationship allows any one component of the subsystem to activate an effort towards common objectives with the full cooperation of others. Unless challenged from outside a subsystem, is often available to dominate a policy-making area. For even a strong subsystem, rivals may emerge. Several challenges in the environment of subsystem politics have become increasingly noticeable, especially in the past dozen or so years. One is the process by which House and Senate leaders refer a bill to more than one congressional committee. This is known as multiple referral. Whereas the Senate requires unanimous consent from such a step, the practice has become more common in the House. A referral may be sequential, going first to one committee, then another, or it may be split, with different parts of the same bill being considered by different committees. One effect of multiple referrals is to strengthen the influence of the chamber's leaders at the expense of committee control over the decision-making process regarding a particular bill. One challenge most evident in debates over budgetary issues is the increasing influence on votes of the full chamber rather than subcommittees or committees. Gridlock refers to government that's so divided no consistent policy direction can be established. Partisanship is political party pressures on elected members of Congress, state legislatures, or local boards and commissions. The influence of similar alliances is often less extensive in state and local policymaking, even with changes in national politics we've just discussed. In many state legislatures, individual committees do not have the same degree of independent standing or jurisdictional control over policy areas that U.S. congressional committees have. In many states and localities, policymaking process is dominated by less diverse groups than nationally. Especially in local government, the policy process is not only less visible, but it's much more informal than at the national level. The general patterns of subsystem politics in the national policy process do not operate to the same extent in state and local government. The phenomenon of issue networks involves a variety of political actors attempting jointly to influence the course of public policy. Unlike subsystems, issue networks are open and fluid groupings of various political actors attempting to influence policy. These are shared knowledge groups having to do with some aspect or problem of public policy. They lack a degree of permanence, commonality of interests, and internal cohesion. Examples of issue networks include the various groups and public officials involved in specific policies such as those dealing with AIDS research. The foundation of shared knowledge that unites network participants often does not lead to the creation of a shared action coalition or a shared belief interest group. Like subsystems, networks function with relative autonomy, but unlike subsystems, they are rarely controlled in a well-organized way or even with agreement on policy content. The expansion of blogs and social networking has led to an increase in the number of issue networks and shared knowledge groups. The political accountability of a bureaucracy is enforced through multiple channels, both legislative and executive. Political interests in the legislature and in the executive branch are frequently at odds with one another, making it difficult to enforce accountability consistently or effectively. The situation is made more complex by the fact that most bureaucracies operate under joint authority delegated by both the chief executive and the legislative branch and have considerable discretion to make independent choices. The difficulty is further compounded by the hybrid systems of personnel management found in different parts of the executive hierarchy in the national government and in many states and localities. Frequently, top executives owe their positions to appointment through political channels, but the bulk of their subordinates are hired and usually retained through job-related merit procedures. Another factor limiting accountability is the inability of top executives to command wholehearted responses from administrative subordinates. Bureaucratic accountability is the principles of political accountability applied in an effort to control bureaucratic power. Bureaucratic accountability implies several things. First, in a legal and constitutional sense, it applies that a political entity is not beyond the control of other entities in a checks and balances system, or ultimately beyond reach of the consent of the governed. Accountability also implies that when an entity exercises delegated authority and discretion in decision making, it also has some responsibility to adhere to the broad will of the governed. However, that has to be expressed. One approach is to interpret election results as reflecting the will of the majority and to define bureaucratic accountability as responsiveness to the chief executive. It is not simply a matter of bureaucracy being accountable. All institutions of government can be accountable only to officials or to institutions outside themselves. Allowing for limitations, such as those just outlined, it's possible to describe some forms of accountability that characterize political relationships between bureaucracy and other parts of the U.S. policy. First, both the President and Congress have many instruments of control at their disposal. Formal responsibility for legislative oversight has passed from full committees to subcommittees. Though many hearings may be held, the overall impact has been less effective oversight. If congressional supervision of the bureaucracy via subcommittees is less reliable now than in the past, bureaucracy autonomy may be greater than ideal. But it appears that, as a macro institution, Congress is also rather limited in its oversight capability. Although there may be weaknesses in legislative oversight of government bureaucracies, they're not beyond fixing, and there may be alternative means of supervising administrative agencies. Some other mechanisms of accountability exist. Bureaucracies are legally accountable to the courts for their observable and individual rights and liberties, whether their investigative capacities or in their routine administrative activity. Accountability is challenged by the availability of technical subject matter in government decision making. Accountability is also made more difficult by the fact that administrators must frequently face situations in which competing criteria for decisions are very much in evidence. Bureaucratic agencies are also held to account by the mass media. The news media's interest in bureaucratic activity is founded on the basic premise of free government and on a powerful ethic of American journalism. As in the case of bureaucracy legislature interactions, relationships between administrators and the media are often two sided.